That was quite a generous introduction, and everything you said about Joan is absolutely true. I'm thrilled to be presenting with her today, and what I'm going to do is share my screen and pull up our PowerPoint, and we'll get it going. Joan, you're up.
All right, thanks, Robin. And we're happy to be here today as well. I was glad, we were really glad to do this conference, this program at the ABA Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs conference. That was virtual. We're still virtual. And if you were in person, you probably wouldn't have this because we might not come down all the way to Florida. So it works out that it's still virtual for us. So we're going to be talking about things that get in the way of being able to be effective in our careers and in our lives. And that is going to be sleep, and it's also going to be connection. But before we do that, we'd like to give you an exercise that can help to bring you into the present and to be here with us today. We know that a lot of people multitask. We understand that. And yet, in this program, we're going to be offering some things that you can really take and use. And so we hope that you will hear those. We have provided a resource list. These are some things that if we're in a seminar where we have access to a chat, we put these in the chat as Robin is discussing these particular resources, but you have that as a specific handout that the Florida Lab will provide to you as whatever way that they would do that. So I'd like to give you a breathing exercise. And when we are involved in paying attention to our breath, it can help us to stop the balls that we're trying to keep in the air over our heads and focus on what we need to focus on. And when you inhale, your heart rate goes up. And so when we're excited and anxious, we might start hyperventilating, and the inhale is much faster than the exhale. And that's why we get more anxious, or it's a part of that. When you exhale, your heart rate goes down, and it can help to calm you. And so the exercise I'm going to give you is called square breathing or box breathing. And it's evidence-based. I'll tell you that the Navy SEALs even use it as part of their training. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4, and hold for 4. All right, you can close your eyes if you wish. You don't have to. This won't take very long. Let's begin. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Hold. And I'll confess that I'm a little bit selfish when I do this because it calms me. The hold is an important piece of it, and I feel my shoulders go down. Things get quieter around me. And at first, when I was doing this, I wondered if the fan went off in the building, but no, it's just my mind quiets. And in fact, you can even ask, and this particular suggestion comes from retired Judge Robert Childers, Butch Childers, who I know is part of the weekly sits that are available through the Mindfulness and Law Society, which is actually Florida-based, and he's in Florida these days. And he says that when he does the inhale, he says, calm my body. And when he does the exhale, he says, calm my mind. And so you can add that if you like. All right, so we're going to get going here. And again, it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to be working with Robin. As John said, the kinds of things she is doing in this space where this is all part of what she's passionate about, it's not her day job, has included leadership involvement in the National Conference of Bar Presidents, our Bar Association, national and international associations, and she's really somebody who is carrying the torch for these issues. And so it's really great to be part of this. We want to give you kind of a context about why we might be a little bit more anxious, why we might have some struggles. And Robin's going to move through some slides that will show you the things that we all know are causing us stress. we've got this virus, which is still with us. I was just talking with someone yesterday who just tested positive for the first time and is actually fairly ill. I live 2 miles away on the next slide from where George Floyd died. And his death has had implications throughout the country and throughout the world as we look at racial justice, and our profession is part of that. On the next slide, we have all of the things going on in politics, and this image could be here every week, and every week what we're thinking about is going to be different. And then many of us on the next slide are living with concerns about what is happening internationally. Now, all of these things can be us, but they are also our clients or the parties that are involved in what we're working with. And so these are additions to the stress we're experiencing. They're additions to what we have to do. And they're additions to the opportunities that our profession has, because every single critical issue in our profession, we are on the front lines, whether it's policy, whether it's litigation, whether it's advising in terms of going back to work, our profession is engaged. And as a result, we're experiencing more stress, but so are our clients. On the next slide, we've just got a list of some of the things we're going to talk about. And we think this is an ethics program. Robin's going to go into this a whole lot more, but it has to do with competence. If we aren't able to bring our best selves, because instead of front of brain analytical thinking, we're in fight, flight, or freeze mode because of that stress, we're not giving our best advice to our clients. And so it may affect diligence and competence. We're going to talk about sleep. We're going to talk about trust and oxytocin and other neuroscience concepts that have a lot to do with how we succeed in the workplace. And we're going to talk about some resilience strategies. On the next slide, we're going to go through this data really fast, but our profession has an alcohol problem. We drink more, including the judges, than the rest of the population. And of course, that has an impact. In terms of other mental health issues, because alcohol use is a mental health issue, and on the next slide, you'll see that, and this is from a 2018 study, 1 in 4 of us have met criteria for depression, and 15% of the judges, almost 1 in 5, anxiety, and judges more than that. And so these are other mental health statistics, and there's much more out there, but this is just the tip of the iceberg that we're giving you for context. And so what happens, and on the next slide, you see our statement, the whole profession feels the impact of all of these things, because it's important to recognize that even though you may have a law license, and some of you may be in support roles, and that's why you're here, everyone you work with and deal with is also experiencing the same stress. They just may not be the ones that sign off on it or give the orders if you happen to be a judge. And so after the data came out about lawyer impairment back in 2016, and this was the first national study, there was a task force that put together a report called The Path to Lawyer Wellbeing, Practical Recommendations for Positive Change. And by the way, that whole consortium has since gone on to call it Wellbeing in Law, because they are recognizing that it's not just licensed attorneys. And so they came up with a group of, with an idea of how do you picture well-being. And so we've got that on the next slide, which is areas of well-being. All right, think about this. And on this diagram, you have occupational and intellectual up on top, as if that's the most important, because that's where our status comes from. But if you look at the supporting areas, emotional, social, physical, spiritual, and then one more slide, we're looking at everything through a cultural lens, whatever that means to us. It can be race, it can be gender, it can be the law school you went to. It can be all kinds of things that are our personal culture, and we see things through that lens. Well, we can give high importance to those occupational and intellectual areas, but if our foundation is faulty, we're going to be paying attention to that. Those other areas, emotional, social, physical, spiritual, and cultural. And we're not going to do our best thinking. So all these aspects of well-being are important. There's also some research from the International Bar Association. Robin, did you want to address this? Or Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the International Bar Association did a global study and it came out, the preliminary results came out in 2021 and the final results recently came out. And they identified as a global phenomenon in the legal profession that the factors that are most important for impacting lawyer well-being are stress, high workload, work-life balance, the working culture or environment, and physical or mental health issues. So this is not unique to the United States. It's not simply that the legal profession is the most unhealthy of all professions based on the data in the United States, but it's a global phenomenon.
Thanks, Robin. So the well-being report identified 3 reasons to take action. And the first one, organizational success. What does that mean? It means the energy that we put into ignoring a problem when it exists. I think of an ostrich with its head in the sand, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. That's kind of our profession. And when we don't deal with these things, there are retention issues. It's very expensive, and it isn't going to get better by itself. So it has an impact on organizations. It's an ethics issue, and you can see the rules that we're citing here. And that also includes being one of the things that people get in trouble for most often. In my state, Minnesota, half the cases involve neglect or non-communication. Well, that's not a healthy lawyer if it gets to the point of being investigated. And if you are a person in a supervisory role and you are aware of an issue and you don't do anything, you could be held responsible. And then it's the right thing to do. When we look at how this relates to discipline issues on the next slide, one of the things that was in an ABA 2021 profile of the legal profession was the idea that a quarter to almost a third of the lawyers facing disciplinary charges have some sort of substance use or mental health issue. And that's why the kind of work that the Florida Lab is doing to help people maintain that recovery is so important. So now we're going to move over to talking about sleep and what this looks like and what we need to know. And every time I listen to this part, I just sit back and learn something new. So Robin, let's hear what you have to say. I can't wait.
Thank you, Joan. So in the field of neuroscience, I'm just intensely interested in understanding how advances in neuroscience and psychology might help me personally, in a selfish way, become a better lawyer. And it turns out that as I'm a guinea pig for all these kind of new advances, what I wanted to do was share what I've learned about these things. And I picked 2 that are really important. One is sleep and one is how to leverage oxytocin. So we're going to focus on those things. And let me begin with sleep. And I think the first thing to think about with sleep is that it's our superpower. To be a good lawyer, you have to be a healthy lawyer. The National Task Force on Lawyer Wellbeing report identifies that very critical element of being a healthy lawyer as critical to being a good lawyer. But what most of us don't know is that almost everything that kills us in the developed nations is causally linked with sleep or lack of sleep. It might be dementia, it might be Alzheimer's disease, it might be stress and anxiety, cardiovascular disease, weight gain, diabetes, and mental health. They're all causally linked with sleep, either sleep disorders, lack of sleep, disrupted sleep. And in fact, the neuroscience literature demonstrates that the very state of wakefulness causes low-level brain damage throughout the day. So we really need sleep. But the problem with trying to get sleep as a lawyer, as you all well know, is that in our lawyer culture, we basically have a culture that we work ourselves to the limit and beyond, that we do everything we can for our clients, even if it means that we have to sacrifice our own well-being and health, that it's a badge of honor. I mean, we all know this, right? It's a badge of honor. I only got 5 hours sleep last night. Well, I pulled an all-nighter, or I've got this going on. And there's a badge of honor associated with hurting ourselves by lack of sleep. And then some people who say, well, I got 8 hours of sleep, I mean, they're shamed for it. You must be lazy if you were able to get 8 hours of sleep. So what I want to do is disabuse you of the dominant narrative of the legal culture and talk to you about how critical sleep is. And once you see the data and the information, you'll never go back. And when I first learned about these things, I learned that I was basically, you know, hurting myself, that I was shortening my life. Like the shorter you sleep, the shorter your life. And all the things I was doing to hurt my cognitive performance and all the things that I thought I was doing great for my clients, it turns out that by not sleeping, I was actually probably not providing really the best service I could. So let's begin. So let me begin with Matthew Walker, who I think is the world's most preeminent neuroscientist, who wrote a book, Justifying Sleep. It turns out that there had never been any book or health professional to explain why sleep was so important. So he did that. And his book is Why We Sleep. But he also has a TED Talk, and I think he has a TEDx talk that's more recent as well. And so if you don't have time to read the book, take a look at the TED Talk. But the reason why I want to raise this book for you is I think that it will be a game changer for you. I highly encourage you to read it. What you will learn is how sleep impacts every aspect of our physiology and our cognitive function, and how it changes over our lifespan from infants to toddlers to adolescents to adults. And then as we get older, what the challenges are. And he also provides sleep strategy for those different phases of our existence. So I highly recommend it. But anyway, Matthew Walker begins his TED Talk by talking about testosterone and testicles. And what he says is that, you know, men who sleep 5 or 6 hours per night, their level of testosterone is the same as someone who's 10 years older. So in fact, their testicles are smaller. And so he begins his TED Talk that way, pulls everyone in. And just so you know, there's a similar negative impact on women's reproductive capabilities as well. And so he pulls you in with that and says, well, you know, if sex matters to you, you got to care about sleep. But there are a whole bunch of other things that we're going to talk about in this presentation that will drive the point home. So sleep, we're supposed to spend a third of our lives sleeping, right? We're supposed to sleep 8 hours a day and be awake 16 hours a day. And sleep seems like a waste of time, right? Haven't you always wanted to like cheat sleep and stay up longer and do all these fun things, or maybe not so fun things? But if you knew what was happening inside your brain, I think that you would get a sense of how critical that 1/3 of your life is in terms of sleep. So what is sleep and what does it do for us? Sleep is a memory aid. So it prepares the brain before learning anything or before taking in any information. Sleep prepares the brain to take in that kind of information and make new memories. And then after after getting that information, what sleep does is it cements it, it solidifies it so that we don't forget it. And in fact, the brain is so brilliant that, you know, you have so much information coming at you all day. The brain filters it for you and remembers the things that are important and forgets the things that are not. And so that is part of your cognitive function that's impacted by sleep. So let's talk about the 2 types of sleep or phases of sleep. There's NREM sleep and REM sleep. And REM sleep, of course, is made famous by the rock band REM. You all know that, but REM is the dream sleep. But let's first talk about NREM sleep, okay? What happens during NREM sleep is that there's all this information and memories coming in all day, and they're stored in a more fragile site. And so what happens during NREM sleep is that memories are moved to a more stable long-term storage site so that they're not forgotten. All right, so that's the most important thing about NREM sleep to remember. NREM sleep tends to dominate early in our sleep cycle. So if we go to bed at midnight and wake up at 8 a.m., most of our NREM sleep is going to be happening between midnight and 4 a.m. Okay, it doesn't mean that there's, you know, not shifts between NREM sleep and REM sleep. That's what happens all night. But most of our NREM sleep happens early in our sleep cycle. REM sleep is the dream sleep, okay? It creates and strengthens neural connections. It makes connections between different parts of our brain that don't normally talk to each other happen while we're sleeping. And it's seen as the fountainhead of wisdom and creativity, emotional intelligence, social intelligence. It's almost like getting a psychological bath. It dissolves, REM sleep helps to dissolve the emotional sting of events throughout the day. So a lot of those famous, phrases like sleep on it, or you'll feel better tomorrow, all things are rooted in REM sleep and the benefits of REM sleep. REM sleep occurs late in the sleep cycle. So if you go to bed at midnight and wake up at 8 a.m., REM sleep is going to be dominant between 4 a.m., but really predominant between 5 and 8 a.m. Okay. So the failure point, and if you take a couple of things away from this, if you need to take a nap, you should feel free to micro sleep right now. But the most important thing to take away is that the failure point for a human being is 16 hours. Being awake after 16 hours, the brain begins to fail. And so we need more than 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep per day to maintain our physiology and our cognitive function. And the big thing to remember, and I never knew that this was true before I started reading this, but the brain is not like a bank. You can't recover the sleep you've lost. I always used to think, oh, I can survive on 5 hours of sleep this week because I'll catch up on the weekends. Your brain doesn't work like that. So we say these things, but it's not true. It's not capable. The brain is not capable of doing this. So you need to maintain your sleep health every day. And then if you miss sleep, you may not be able to catch it up because the brain doesn't work like that. All right. So what happens to your brain without sleep? All right. And think about this. If we sleep 7 hours per day for 10 days, our brain is just as dysfunctional as if we had pulled an all-nighter. And that to me is astonishing information because 7 hours of sleep, doesn't that sound like great, like a huge victory? But instead, it just shows you how critical that extra half hour to hour of sleep is for us. So 7 hours a day is not sufficient. Getting 3 full nights of recovery sleep doesn't restore your performance back to normal levels. So again, keep this in mind. The brain doesn't work like a bank, so you can't catch up later. And even if you get 7 hours of sleep and think that's a victory, you are still dysfunctional as if you had pulled an all-nighter. Okay, so you are impaired. The big thing about sleep is that, and I'll just mention this, is that we're impaired about being impaired. So in other words, we think we're fine, but because we're so dysfunctional without sleep, we're not a good judge of our own impairment when it comes to sleep. So we're just like the person who's had maybe too much to drink and says, give me the keys to the car, I can drive. With sleep, we're the same way. We think, oh, I got 7 hours, that's fine. Or I'm fine on 5 hours. Everyone else may need 7.5 to 9, but I'm the exception. I've got that, rare, function where I can sleep only 5 hours a day and I'm fine. We're dysfunctional about our dysfunctionality. So let's talk about physical health. As I said earlier, short sleeping, and that's what it's called, short sleeping. If you don't sleep 7.5 to 9 hours a day, it's short sleeping. Short sleeping has a negative impact on your physical health. It contributes to dementia, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, stroke, stress and anxiety, all these things on this screen. Every single thing that you don't want wrong with you is causally linked with sleep. And let me talk to you about how deep it goes, that it gets to the cellular level in terms of lack of sleep and its impact. There was a study done by the Surrey Sleep Research Center in England. And what they did was they took a group of participants and healthy men and women who were getting 8 to 8.5 hours of sleep per night. And this group was restricted to 6 hours of sleep for 1 week. And what the researchers did was they looked at the genetic profile of these individuals during the time they were getting the right amount of sleep, and also during the time that their sleep was restricted. And what happened and what they found was that the activity of 711 genes was distorted for those people who were sleep restricted. Half of the genes were amplified and half of the genes were shut down. So the ones that were amplified are the ones that are linked to chronic inflammation, cellular stress, tumor growth, and factors causing cardiovascular disease. And the ones that were turned off are the ones that help maintain a stable metabolism and immune responses, including killer cells that are responsible for fighting tumors and cancer. So if you don't think it impacts you, it does, and it impacts you at the cellular level. So let's, more importantly, since we're lawyers, we're going to talk about some other factors that are part of our lawyer culture that intersect with sleep. So alcohol is prevalent at bar meetings and gatherings of lawyers. It's built into our culture, but alcohol is actually a sedative and it disrupts sleep. And it doesn't induce natural sleep. So, you say, oh, I think I'll have a drink, that'll help me sleep. Actually, it won't. It'll sedate you. It might knock you out. It will repress REM sleep. It is the most powerful inhibitor of REM sleep known. And even consuming moderate amounts of alcohol in the afternoon or evening reduce REM sleep. So what's the recommendation? The recommendation is you have happy hours at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, because the alcohol will be fully metabolized by the time you go to bed at midnight. So that usually gets, a huge round of applause whenever we're in person doing this CLE. Everyone wants to have happy hour at 1 o'clock. But the most important thing is that you don't want to suppress your REM sleep. You don't want to inhibit it. And that's what alcohol does to you. So think about it, the half-life, the quarter life of alcohol, because of its longevity in the bloodstream, you really do need to manage yourself. So if you care about your REM sleep and your creativity, your social intelligence, your emotional intelligence, you want to make sure that you monitor when you're drinking and make sure that you've got enough time to metabolize so that you get a full night's sleep. Driving. So it turns out that vehicular accidents are more likely to be caused by micro-sleeping at the wheel than through the consumption of alcohol. Why is this? Because when you consume alcohol, you do respond while you're driving. It's just that it takes you a while. There's a delay. But when you're micro-sleeping, there's no response at all. You're just not responding while you're driving. So again, sleep deprivation, okay, is one of the most dangerous things to driving. And of course, we all drive as part of being a lawyer, but we also care about the people we drive, the members of our family and our friends. Let's talk about caffeine, because caffeine has always been, my drug of choice. And I typically have bottles of Mountain Dew or other energy drinks. And I think that, I have this idea that it gets me through the day. So let me tell you a little bit about this. So there is a chemical called adenosine that builds up in our brain through the 16 hours that we're awake. And at some point, the pressure caused by adenosine is one of the things that helps us fall asleep. And so caffeine will block the impact of adenosine. Okay, it doesn't get rid of it, but it blocks the impact. And so that's how caffeine keeps us awake. But it turns out that there's a neuroscientist, and her name is Sarah Mednick. And she has a TEDx talk, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that later. But what she did was she wanted to look at, well, what is the impact of caffeine? Like, let's talk about, if people get 8 hours of sleep, what she found was your sleep declines over the course of a day. But she's like, how can we get people's performance back to baseline? And she said, let's test breaks. And it turns out that taking a break and doing fun things doesn't get your performance back to baseline. And she also said, well, let's see if we can motivate people. Let's bribe them. Let's give them some money and see if that gets their performance, up to speed. And apparently that motivation didn't do anything. And then she said, well, let's try caffeine. Let's see the impact of caffeine. And caffeine didn't do it either, even though we think it does. Okay. What does do it? A nap. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I did want to warn you that there's this thing, cultural thinking that caffeine is going to boost my performance. Caffeine is going to, make me, cognitively sharp. And I do want to let you know that there's some neuroscience research out there that says maybe not. So keep that in mind. LED lights. So exposure to LED lights will impact our circadian rhythm, and it'll wind our internal 24-hour clock back by a few hours. So make sure when it's time for sleep that you limit your exposure to LED lights. keep LED lights out of your room, your bedroom. Keep these LED devices and other devices that you might be using, like iPhones and so forth. Keep them out of your sleep environment and keep exposure limited the few hours leading up to sleep, because that's going to be something that helps you not only increase the chances of triggering sleep, like falling asleep, but it also impacts staying asleep. So just be aware of that. Our mental health. So sleep disruption contributes to all major psychiatric conditions. And the ones that we've seen most prevalent in the legal profession are depression, anxiety, and suicidality. And so keep this in mind too, that sleep disruption is part and parcel of our mental health, not just our cognitive performance, not just every aspect of our physiology. It's really the magic for human beings. And one other thing to note with respect to anxiety and stigma and ethics. So there is this, when we get in a state of anxiety, that just kind of biases our perception of what's happening around us. You all know, like, you're a little grumpy when you haven't had enough sleep, right? And you might get more anxious, and you look at everyone suspiciously, like, oh, what did they mean by that? When they said that, they said hi to me, but they didn't say it with the right tone of voice. You know what I mean? You get suspicious. And what this means is that we have, our lack of sleep has an impact not only on our cognitive function, but how we interact with others, how we perceive them. And it impacts diversity, equity, and inclusion work, because it means that you look at people who are different than you with fear and suspicion. And so again, these are things that we all know from our own personal experience, right? We've all experienced it: suspiciousness, unhappiness, being grumpy, and your friends will tell you and call you out on it. But when they're not there to call you out on it, you've got, all those things, being said, the tape running through your brain that says various things. And it ends up being an ethical sinkhole with respect to interacting with people who are differently than us. The other piece of it is that when you lack sleep, you're more likely to make unethical decisions, okay? Because your rationality is not intervening, okay? You're not able to access your higher cognitive function. You're actually exercising system 1 thinking rather than system 2 thinking, if you're familiar with those phrases. But our higher rational thought, rather than, the automatic control kind of pathways of thinking, are not able to be accessed when you lack sleep. And in fact, short sleep really does impact the workforce. And let me just tell you about some studies so you get a sense of the impact of sleep and productivity. If you have lack of sleep, you're going to be looking at things through a fear-based lens, and you're selfish, you're grumpy, irritable, you make negative inferences about other people, your social intelligence is out the window. And that means that you're going to be not only making decisions that aren't really based on reality, but it's going to give you a slower work rate. You're going to complete tasks in a slower way. You're going to be less accurate when you devise solutions to problems. You're going to have fewer creative solutions, and it's going to take longer to accomplish your goals. It also, lack of sleep, prompts people to cheat more, to be hostile, because they can't regulate their emotions and impulses. So just keep these things in mind when you think about sleep, because it's not only important for you, but it's important for your team, for your organization, for all the goals that you may have. Okay, and then finally, I want to talk about the power of the downstate. I mentioned Sarah Mednick last time, just a few moments ago, regarding her TEDx talk. What she talks about is that how our performance declines across the day. If you look at 9 a.m. to 7 p.m., you're going to see a steady decline in cognitive performance throughout the day. And a 60-minute nap, she finds, based on her study, is something that can get you back to baseline performance. Matthew Walker, who's the expert on sleep, talks about naps and when you should take them and when you shouldn't. And sometimes naps are not going to be helpful for you. But I do want to open the door to naps, a complicated issue where neuroscientists disagree about how much to sleep for a nap, whether to take one. But for sure, if naps prevent you from falling asleep during your regular sleep time, you should not be taking them. But a short nap is known and proved to restore cognitive function. And then Mednick also talks about one other thing. She says our performance declines across the week. Monday through Friday, we see a steady decline in performance across the week. And she said we need to take breaks. And so her recommendation is on Wednesday, taking a half day off to get that break, or be doing something different than what you usually do so that you can, again, hit it with full force on Thursday and Friday. So let's talk about some sleep strategies, because sleep is important. And I did want to mention just a few more things about sleep. You need to stick to a sleep schedule and go to bed and wake up at the same time. You're kind of like training yourself. So here are this is one really important sleep strategy. You shouldn't be taking a nap if you can't fall asleep at night. Don't take a nap, because that's going to interfere with your circadian rhythm and your ability to sleep. Exercise is going to inhibit your ability to fall asleep. So if you're someone who likes to exercise at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, recognize that that's going to mean that you're not going to be able to fall asleep till much later. It's going to impact your circadian rhythm by 2 or 3 hours. Avoid caffeine and nicotine. The research does not demonstrate, well, the research demonstrates that cannabis consumption does not impact sleep. So caffeine and nicotine are, at least in the literature, are identified as the challenge. Don't drink alcohol before you go to bed, because you're going to inhibit your REM sleep. And here are some other tips. The LED devices, the sleeping pills, again, are a sedative. They're like alcohol. They knock you out, but they don't induce natural sleep. And then the last one, sleep divorce. If if your partner makes lots of noise while they sleep, sleep divorce is something that's recommended by neuroscientists. Matthew Walker says that not only will you get better sleep through sleep divorce, but you're going to be more interested in intimate relations, because lack of sleep has an impact not only on your testicles and your ovaries and your reproductive prowess, but it also impacts your interest in intimate relations. So keep that in mind. And then what I want to end with is a couple of things. There are some people who are what we call night owls, and some people are morning larks. And I just want to let you know that that's genetically determined. So if you're someone who's a 5 a.m. riser and you go to bed at 9, that's genetically determined. Morning larks constitute about 40% of our population. The night owls, if you're someone who wakes up late and stays up till 2, 3 in the morning, night owls comprise 30% of the population. And again, it's genetically determined. Our whole workday is structured around the morning larks, okay? So keep that in mind, and don't beat yourself up if, you have to get up early and you're a night owl and your performance naturally is not going to be at its peak when everyone's in the office. Because as a night owl, your performance is going to be peaking around 5 to 8 p.m. No one's there to watch you and watch how brilliant you are. If you're a supervisor, keep that in mind. The morning larks, they're there, and they're ready to shine. They show up early. Aren't they great? They're the first in the door, and everyone can see how great they are at what they do. But the night owls are often discriminated against. And I want people to know, if you're a night owl, that it is genetically determined. The other thing I want to let you know is this. If you stay up late or get up early, it's going to have a disproportionate impact on your sleep, okay? And keep this in mind too. So say you go to bed at midnight and you would normally wake up at 8, but you're staying up late because you got to write a brief or you're preparing for court tomorrow. If you stay up late, you're losing a disproportionate amount of that NREM sleep, because most of your NREM sleep happens early in your sleep cycle, all right? If you have something else going on where you're going to wake up early, so you go to bed at midnight, but you're waking up at 6 a.m. because you got to get somewhere in the morning, you're not just losing just a few hours of sleep, you're losing 60 to 90% of your REM sleep by doing that. So keep that in mind, manage yourself. And I think that you'll, as Matthew Walker said, sleep is the single most effective thing we can do to reset our brain and body health each day. And I hope that you will remember that. There's a sleep loss epidemic in the industrialized nations declared by the WHO. And the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. So please heed this information. And I hope that you'll be able to take back something useful for you and your family and those you care about. Joan?
Thanks, Robin. We did have one question, and I know you've addressed this in other seminars. What about melatonin?
Sure. So the body produces melatonin naturally, and it doesn't make you sleep. It actually puts you into a state of kind of quiet wakefulness that helps promote sleep. Okay, so it's not what makes you sleep, but it gets you ready for it. And there's increases of levels of melatonin in the evening, usually 2 hours before bedtime. And exposure to light at nighttime can block melatonin. And that's sometimes why we get jet lag when we travel. But there's 50 to 70 million Americans who suffer from some sort of sleep disorder, and melatonin is often used to help regulate or promote sleep. It's a hormone that promotes sleep. And what it does is it suppresses the neurons in the brain that keep you awake. And the mechanism is still being studied because it's not really very well known, but it inhibits certain neurons that keep you awake. So what I would recommend that you take a look at is make sure that you understand how it works and work with your physician. The Johns Hopkins website has excellent resources on melatonin and how to manage it in conjunction with your physician.
Thanks, Robin. And there's also a question regarding waking up during the night. And this is a good place to offer a resource that is actually going to be on the handout that we provide to you. And this is a breathing exercise that is promoted or developed, I'm not sure what, but where I found it was Dr. Andrew Weil's website. And unlike the box breathing that I talked about earlier, and don't do this one now, and it will be in the handout, but it has to do with how you regulate your breathing. And this is where you inhale for 4 counts, you exhale, you hold for 7, and you exhale for 8, 4, 7, 8. And you're supposed to do it 3 times, and you're supposed to have your mouth closed enough that your tongue is touching the roof of your mouth. So don't do it now, but I'm a pretty skeptical person about those kinds of things, and yet it always works for me. And my husband is more skeptical, and it works for him. I don't know why. Dr. Weil may explain it on his website, but that will be in the handout that is available to you. We're going to move forward, and Robin, maybe you can take a look at if there's additional questions, but we'll move forward to the rest of the presentation at this point. And Robin, if there's something that you want to break in with, or maybe we can have time for questions at the end. So kind of looking at where we are right now, think about how we were when something happened that made us have to act quickly. So it could be the kind of weather you've had in Florida. Sometimes it could be the pandemic. We have something called surge capacities, where we adapt very quickly. But when we have things that go on for a while, the disaster can stretch out indefinitely. And so when we take a look at these aspects of well-being again, what we see is to think about them. And that's on the next slide, is where am I struggling here? And where am I strongest? And nurturing where you're strongest and paying attention to where you aren't, but recognizing that sometimes you only have to manage that. You don't have to turn that into your biggest strengths. And we're in an emotional long haul. That's on the next slide. I think we'll have a little cultural, okay, there we go. And so we're all experiencing the additional stress and anxiety, and we see the light at the end of the tunnel, but what we see is the tunnel's longer, and we can see all the stuff inside of it. And remember, we're on the front lines of everything. And so we can go from the anguish that may have come when something first came onto us to languishing. And that principle on the next slide is something where it's not depression, but it's also not thriving. It's like well-being just isn't there. And what can happen is we're less motivated, and we're not getting as much done and we're not as focused. And we begin to wonder, is what I'm doing does it even matter? And in fact, during the pandemic, a lot of people changed careers for a variety of reasons, but that was part of it. We may have difficulty paying attention, and it can be a predictor for other mental health issues in our profession. So this is kind of recognizing this, because when we call it by name and recognize it, then we weaken its impact on us. And we're going to talk about some strategies for that. But first, Robin's going to be talking about trust and oxytocin.
Thanks, Joan. So I want to talk to you about oxytocin and how we could leverage it to manage our happiness and productivity and economic prosperity. This is a picture of Finland and is actually, according to the World Happiness Report, the happiest country on earth and the most economically prosperous country on earth. It turns out that economic prosperity is inextricably linked with well-being, and you can design and create well-being and joy in your organization. So I want to talk to you about how. The World Happiness Report is one way that we get these global indicators of the well-being of countries, of populations, and of individuals. But oxytocin is what's happening inside your body that causes all this to happen. Oxytocin is known for the drug of sex, the drug of pregnancy, but in fact, it's also the drug of our humanity. Oxytocin basically embodies the golden rule: trust begets trust. And this is how your brain actually works. This molecule, it's not COVID, it's oxytocin. And Paul Zak, in his book, he's a neuroeconomist, or otherwise known as a voodoo economist, because he would draw blood from various populations for people and measure their oxytocin when he was testing his theories in this book. And in this book, Paul Zak talks about the chemical basis of trust, which is oxytocin. And he's got a book called The Trust Factor, which teaches us how to manage and lead organizations and teams in a way that promotes trust and promotes prosperity and success. So you can design your own personal life around oxytocin, and you can also design your teams, your interactions with other people to leverage oxytocin. So how does this all work? So I've told you that oxytocin is the chemical basis of trust and joy and laughter and morality and empathy. And how it works is when someone trusts you, and when you are extended trust, this is the golden rule, right? But when that happens, there's a surge in oxytocin. All right, so all I have to do is extend trust to someone, or if someone extends trust to me, there's going to be a surge of oxytocin. And what happens then is you have the ability to walk in other people's shoes. You have empathy for other people who have extended you trust, or when you extend trust, you're generating that same generosity and trust in them. And you can treat other people like family, where you have this trust generated biochemically. And there's lots of things you can do with that. Not only does it make us feel good to extend trust to others and have it reciprocated and feel valued and part of a team, but our brain rewards us for our cooperation, because if there's a surge in oxytocin, then other things happen. What happens? You get a surge in serotonin and dopamine, and those are the reward chemicals in our brain, and it reduces anxiety. High stress is something that blocks oxytocin, and testosterone blocks oxytocin. And so how can we manage ourselves and manage our interactions with others in order to promote our well-being, promote trust, and make our teams work really well and achieve common goals and prosperity and client service? Well, let's talk about how we might be able to do that. There are some brain hacks where we can interrupt the impact of cortisol and testosterone in terms of its blocking oxytocin. And here's some brain hacks for you to try out and see how it works. Hugs. So everyone knows when they hug someone they really love, or they hug their pet, you feel good. Well, it turns out there are oxytocin receptors in certain parts of your body. And so when you hug other people, you're generating a surge of oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin. And that's why hugging feels so good. In the workplace, hugging may most likely be unprofessional and probably not acceptable in certain circumstances. But it turns out that just a handshake or putting your hand on someone's shoulder or doing elbow bumps or just those kinds of things can also generate oxytocin and that feeling of well-being. Belly rubs, so you can rub the belly of your dogs. That's why dogs love them. It's not just that they feel good, but in fact, there are all these oxytocin receptors in between your ribs. And so you can give yourself a massage between your ribs if you need a surge in oxytocin. And you can do that when you want to engage in really authentic pro-social behavior. Other things that help, of course, are massages, sex, those kind of things promote oxytocin. And then let's talk about laughter. So there is Dr. Kataria in India is someone who invented laughter yoga. And what happens is, and it's a worldwide phenomenon, okay? He is someone, 111 countries have laughter clubs. You can find them in schools and hospitals and universities. This person, Dr. Kataria, is like a global star. You can see him leading laughter clubs and sessions with major movie stars, corporate CEOs across the globe. And so what happens is when you laugh, or even if you force yourself to laugh, ha, 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 it sounds so stupid, right? You sound so inauthentic. But if you keep doing it, you will make yourself laugh because you're so ridiculous. And then what happens is when you're authentically laughing, and especially if this happens in a group, you reach this meditative state. And it's similar to walking, using a labyrinth and walking around a labyrinth or through meditation. You've gotten into the state of thought-free laughter. So that's another recommendation. And again, here's the graphic of trust, which is something that will create that surge in oxytocin. And then Palzak has this whole field of neuromanagement, which is how can we design our workplaces and how we interact with other people and teams and organizations to leverage oxytocin and promote this trust culture that's going to be so prosperous for us. And what I want to do is talk about a couple of them because I want to make sure that we have time. Well, actually, I'm not sure we have time. Joan, what do you think? Should we go to the rest of it after I give a teaser? Oh.
Why don't you spend a little bit of time on this? I know there's a few questions that are very specific. But I would really like to get to our resilience strategies. So yeah, give the teaser, but maybe an extended one.
Okay, so I'm going to give a teaser, which is there are things that we can do to leverage oxytocin and create a culture of trust and purpose and engagement, which is what everyone's really talking about, joy and performance in our work. And so it's in your power. You can leverage oxytocin to do this. You don't have to be at the effect of your environment, but you can actually design your environment. And one of the best ways to do this is through ovation, which is authentic recognition of colleagues who contribute to successes. And this counts for 67% of organizational trust, holding other factors constant. And the best known utilizer of ovation is Zappos and the Container Store. So with that, I'm going to jump ahead to Joan's part of the presentation, and thank you.
Thanks, Robin. So we want to spend some time talking about some resilience strategies, things that are going to incorporate everything that you've heard. And I also want to give Robin a chance to answer any questions that are in the Q&A that we can offer. So these are the things we're going to talk about that can help to give us a more ethical mindset and can support us in being able to do front of mind thinking. So next slide, Robin. Oops. When we think about resilience and we think about how it helps us, if we 3 years ago had seen this and had seen immunity, we would have thought, well, okay, that's nice, I guess. And now it's like, really, bring it on. How do I do this? Because that has become important to us. And you can see that it's helpful in a number of ways. But the other one I want to call attention to is it reduces our perceptions that if something is threatening to us. And it also reduces perceptions of pain, whether it's mental pain or physical pain. And remember when Robin talked about how we see things more suspiciously? Well, that relates to this as well. The resilience can actually have an impact on that. Next slide. When we think about this in an ethical context, we can look at, and this is the model rule, we can look at 1.3 and the comment, which says a lawyer's workload must be controlled so that each matter can be handled competently. This is telling us that we need to make sure that we can do that work. So it may be that that Wednesday afternoon break is something that is our ethical responsibility if it actually helps you. There's research that shows that over the course of a day, judges' decisions become more harsh. And so that's something to think about too when you are wondering what time of day your hearing is going to be. And then we have the rule lawyer as advisor, which is that we get to be more than technicians. So think about that. Thinking about that relationship with your client as how do I make a difference for this person today? As opposed to I have this thing I have to get done. And then there are rules about reporting professional misconduct, and there are exceptions based on somebody's possible involvement with a lawyer assistance program. And again, this is the model rule, so it may not be equivalent to the Florida rule. As we move on to the next slide, remember I talked about languishing. Well, here are some antidotes to that. How do you find a way to give full attention to something? And it doesn't have to be work. It can be something that absorbs you for a period of time. Like lots of people are doing Wordle games. It probably takes you 2 minutes and yet you're totally out of everything else and you get to come back. And from listening to Robin, I know that I shouldn't be doing my Wordle at the last thing before I go to bed because it's on my phone. How are you making connections? What mindfulness tools are you using? And then setting small manageable goals. I can get this done in this amount of time, and it can be a work project, or it can also even be something that is personal, like completing a crossword puzzle, but where you're all in. And on the next slide, we start talking about these specific strategies. So I want to begin with mindfulness. And what this is every day attention. What are you noticing? Mindful noticing. And so it might be something like turning the light off when you leave the room, that you notice that. You've decided you're going to notice that. It can be medium things that are actually practices. Everything from the square breathing that I told you about to a more extended meditation to a yoga practice, mindful walking, being aware of your surroundings when you exercise, and then moving to the bigger picture, which is what is my place in this world? What is my legacy? Where do I make a difference? How can I make that difference today? How can I make that difference this year? And being aware of that and paying attention to it. And that sort of thinking reduces our stress. The next strategy I want to give you is one that Robin talked about with oxytocin, and that is making connections. We all need relationships to be happy and to be satisfied and to feel that we have a place. And you know that physical touch releases oxytocin. Well, in this world of some of you possibly still working remotely, you may not have that handshake. And so I want to remind you that you've got 5 senses. And so if what you're doing is communicating with somebody who is on a screen with you, well, if you were in an office and they were at a conference table, and you might even say this while you're meeting in person, you would have a legal pad down here, and you might have a second screen over here. And on camera, they don't know what you're looking at. You're checking your email and you're on Facebook. So if you say, while we're talking, you may notice that I'm not looking at you. And what I'm doing is I'm taking notes and I'm checking what I have open on your file. And just letting them know that you're present, that is part of establishing that connection. And that can also be in other situations. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about the benefits of connection. And look at that. It's the same as resilience benefits generally. And so that reduced perception of pain and threat because you have a meaningful connection with someone. And if you are finding that that relationship feels threatening, sometimes there's a good reason for that, but other times it's because you haven't taken time to get to know the person or to spend some time with them. So it's something to think about. Our next resilience strategy is boundaries. And these are going to be different depending on whether it's a client or a party, whether it's a colleague or whether it's personal. And you need to feel safe. You need to feel that it's reasonable, and you need to feel that you all are allowing it. And it's going to be all of those aspects of well-being. So when you're setting boundaries, the next slide, you're looking at what are my boundaries for each relationship category, and ask for what you need. Sometimes you have to say, this is what I need, or I need us to do this, or you walk away and say, it seems like this isn't a good place to continue this conversation. Why don't we come back? And if you're dealing with someone who's traumatized and that's what's happening, and it's something that's manifesting at the time, drawing that boundary of we need to take a break. Okay, that's a boundary as well. And if you find yourself being upset, what did you allow? I mean, not so much your fault, but you allowed a boundary to be crossed, or at least that's the perception. What can you do differently next time? What have you learned from that? So treating it as a learning experience. The next resilience strategy is perspective. And I want to give you this. And by the way, I'm going to give credit to my colleague in New Jersey who does work that I do, Nancy Steck, for teaching me this particular tool. And so when you think about something that causes you stress, let's think about the check engine light in your car, okay? What's the worst that could happen? And in our profession, that's what we do. We look for the worst that could happen, and we awfulize things because our job is to see that so that we can recover for it or we can prevent it. If you're drafting a contract, you want to anticipate every breach so you can put in the protections. And so what's the worst that could happen? And how likely is that to happen? And what must I do for that to happen? So the check engine light goes on in your car. My engine's going to fall out of my car in the middle of the highway. How likely? Not. All right. But what must I do? Nothing. If I do nothing, then something's going to happen to my car. What's the best that could happen? It's a fuse, and that's why the light went on. What can I do? I can have it looked at. So it's too bad we can't plug those things into our brains that you can plug into your car that gives you a diagnostic code, right? And so you go from being the victim or the passenger to being the driver. So when you have that difficult situation, what's the best that could happen? What can I do for that to happen? And what are those steps and how do I proceed? And what can I control? Because there's very little you can. Imagine, let's say you're a lawyer. Most of you are. And you can't control the other party or the other lawyer, sometimes your client, and the judge. What you can control is your best work, and that is everything we've been talking about today. The next resilience strategy is gratitude. And that is where we think about who are we grateful to and why? And that's going to be our clients. That's going to be personally. But actually taking the time to consider that. Looking at the benefits of gratitude, which is on the next slide, what you will see is the same thing, all right, as we have for other resilience strategies, but there's less loneliness and isolation is such a trigger for the challenges that we have in this profession. Gratitude practices on the next slide are things like keeping a journal or writing a letter to somebody that you want to thank, living or dead. You may not actually send it. Those feelings of gratitude, by creating them, are stronger. They benefit us as much as the person to whom we are grateful. I find that one of my gratitude practices is just kind of take a deep breath, and it's like, what am I grateful for? And things rise to the surface. And it's just so powerful to say to somebody, when I was doing my gratitude meditation, you were who I found I was grateful to, and here's why. And it really makes those strong connections. And then finally, ask for help. And that's on the next slide. When we do that, we can recognize that we don't have to go through this alone, that there's somebody out there to help you. And I strongly suggest that you consider your lawyer assistance program there in Florida, which is very well regarded across the country as the incredible resource it is, and that you utilize that to the fullest extent that you can. I want to thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn this back over to Robin for our last few minutes to answer the questions we have and give any final thoughts. But thanks, John, for inviting us. Delighted to be here. And by the way, I am grateful to Robin because she is doing this program on her birthday. Happy birthday, Robin.
Thank you, Joan. So I want to pick up on gratitude because it turns out that having a gratitude journal is something that you can use to help you fall asleep. Because when, as Joan was saying, when you start to become, mindful of who you're really grateful for, it's something that has a calming and exhilarating feeling, and it's something that helps you fall asleep and stay asleep. So that's one sleep tip that we didn't talk about. There were a couple of questions that I don't know the answer to. So I don't know the answers to the questions about blackout shades and blue blocker glasses. But I do have a couple of comments on some of the other questions. So if you're waking up in the middle of the night, it means that you're able to fall asleep, but then you're not able to stay asleep. Those are the two things, the two challenges of sleep: trigger to sleep and then staying asleep. And sometimes there are certain things that you can do to train yourself. Like, for example, it could be that in the middle of the night, you always wake up because you have to use the restroom or you want to get a glass of water or something. And so maybe anticipating those things or trying to manage that. Those are frequent reasons why people wake up in the middle of the night. But if you're waking up in the middle of the night because you think that you've been habituated to check on something, it could be that you need to talk to a sleep specialist, and the sleep specialists are the ones who can monitor your sleep and then help you develop personalized strategies for like really, personalized sleep challenges. So I would recommend, and they are out there. So I would recommend sleep specialists. Someone asked about caffeine, and with caffeine, there's a half-life of 5 to 7 hours. So early afternoon coffee will impact your sleep. So based on the fact that the half-life of caffeine is 5 to 7 hours, you probably want to be having your caffeine before noon in order to make sure it's out of your system by the time you fall asleep. And that's it. And thank you, John. It's been a pleasure. I'm so excited that I was able to be with you today. I thought I was going to be in trial, but instead I'm with you. And so thank you.
Well, thank you. And if you have a moment, please go through and look at some of the comments. If you get any royalties on that book, I got about 5 people texting me saying they just ordered it. They sent me their screenshots of Amazon confirmation. And I finally had to put in the chat to put comments in the Q&A if they were enjoying this, because my phone wouldn't stop and I couldn't focus on people kept telling me how great you are. I could not agree more. Again, I wasn't going to let you off the hook, Joan. I was going to keep after this, and I did for 2 years. So thank you for freeing up your schedules and joining us. With that, I'll let you folks go, but please take a minute to look at the Q&A.
All right. And I will just say that people can reach me at the email help, HELP, at mnlcl.org. If you have questions you would like to ask beyond this program, and if it's something that Robin should be answering, I'll make sure that she gets it. So thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.